Welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. For months, you could hear the word echoing from congressional offices and television studios all over Washington. Russia, Russia, Russia. The very people who spent 70 years making excuses for the Soviet Union were suddenly convinced that Russian agents had visited our shores in the dead of night to murder American democracy and install their puppet in our White House. Trump won because of Vladimir Putin. That was their claim. It seemed confusing to most people, but to our decadent and deeply unimpressive ruling class, the explanation made perfect sense. How else could their candidate, the candidate of both Nancy Pelosi and the Bush family, have lost last November's election? Well, the media assured them that would never happen. In fact, a year ago today, the New York Times ran this prediction, quote, Hillary Clinton has a 93% chance to win, and they believed it. When she didn't win, our elites assumed a foreign power must have intervened. No other explanation made sense to them. The only thing they lacked was evidence that it had happened. And so to find that, they told us we needed an immediate, all-hands-on-deck investigation of Russian interference. So we got one. Boy, did we. It turned out to be one of the most comprehensive investigations of anything in the history of this country. The FBI kicked it off and was soon joined by a fully staffed Office of Independent Counsel, as well as both houses of Congress. Almost every media outlet in America jumped obediently on board, pouring massive resources into a news story that started to look a lot like a conspiracy theory. But ahead they went. An entire generation of non-Russian speaking cable news hosts remade themselves into amateur criminologists. Remember that? The frenzy spun out of control. And soon, liberals weren't simply talking about a stolen election, but about war, actual war.
If Russia is going to keep attacking America, then America really should fight back. There is an entire building in St. Petersburg filled with a Russian troll army, creating thousands of tweets, memes, news site comments, and flat-out fake stories designed not to take sides on any issue, but just to get us fighting about it. Hillary Clinton spent over $1 billion on the campaign, and the Russians beat her with 150 grand because they were able to turn Facebook into Fakebook.
So you're accusing a nuclear-armed adversary of committing an act of war, and you're doing it purely in order to gain an advantage in a domestic political dispute? No normal person would do that. It's too reckless and crazy. Yet that's exactly what many of our leaders did, including, by the way, sitting members of Congress. They called it war, too. Mass hysteria does not even begin to capture this. We are living in a moment that makes the McCarthy era look reasoned and considered. At least Joe McCarthy was onto something real. There really were Soviet spies. There was no Russian collusion in last year's election. So how are all those investigations going? Well, the New York Times, to its credit, took a look at that this weekend, and it turns out that if the Russians got Trump elected, they left no trace of it. Even Senator Dianne Feinstein of California had to admit that after wasting untold time and money, her committee has not found evidence of collusion between Putin and the Trump campaign. The whole thing is a dry well, a crock, a fraud, a scam, a politically induced hallucination. It's totally nuts. A lot of people should be deeply ashamed of this. Not that they are, of course. But that doesn't mean we haven't learned anything. Robert Mueller's team of investigators apparently has found evidence of suspected wrongdoing by the Podesta Group, which you'll remember is a lobbying firm founded by Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta, and his brother, Tony. According to news accounts, the Podestas may have violated criminal law by failing to register as lobbyists for foreign powers. Not exactly the development Democrats were hoping for when they cheered Mueller's appointment as independent counsel. And then there's the ongoing Uranium One scandal, which has been explained in a series of devastating pieces by the Hill newspaper. Back in 2010, in a move that virtually nobody will now defend, the Obama administration allowed a Russian firm to gain control over about 20% of our uranium reserves here in the United States. Before the deal was approved, Obama's Department of Justice uncovered a massive Russian racketeering and bribery ring working to get control of that uranium. The Obama administration kept that information secret, even from Congress, and let that deal go through. Now, why would they do that? Did it have anything to do with the more than $100 million Hillary Clinton's family foundation took from Uranium One board members? She was the Secretary of State at the time. Maybe, just a guess. At some point, we'll find out for sure. And that's the upside of the hysteria over Russian collusion. Its unintended consequences will be fun to watch. Because when you make up a fake scandal, you never really know where it's going to go. Richard Goodstein has seen a lot of fake scandals. He's been in D.C. a long time. He's a lawyer who's advised both of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaigns, and he joins us tonight. Thanks a lot, Richard. Good to see you.
Great to have you back.
So I was thinking tonight as I was writing this, I was thinking, Russia obviously is the greatest geostrategic threat we've ever faced in this country. I know that because I listen to the Democrats, all my neighbors. And I wonder if this has caused you to rethink the position that Democrats had for 70 years when the Soviet Union existed, where they made excuses for the Soviet Union and prevented, for example, missile defense from being built in this country. Are you rethinking that? Is anyone atoning for that? Because I watched it and that happened.
Yeah, I don't think that's a fair characterization. Look, I think what this Uranium One scandal, and you'll pardon me if I put it like that, shows me that the people pushing this feel like the noose of Mueller is tightening. Because otherwise, no self-respecting person, based on the facts, not an ounce of uranium has been exported. The price of uranium has dropped by 2/3 since this deal was passed. And there's zero evidence, notwithstanding the fact that the Republicans controlled the House and the Senate and could have investigated to a fare thee well, not one stitch of evidence that Hillary Clinton had anything to do with it, didn't even know about it, nor should she have.
Okay, so I agree with the last point. Actually, the Republicans could have investigated, and they didn't. And that's a fair question, I would say. But it's hard to believe that you're going to defend that decision, signing off on the Uranium One deal, as a policy matter. Knowing what you know about Russia, was it really a good idea for the Obama administration and the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to approve a deal giving the Russians control of 20% of our uranium supply? Why was that in our interest?
So again, none of this will ever leave. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission keeps this from being exported.
That is false. That is false. That is absolutely false. You were wrong on that.
What's the evidence of that?
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has conceded that that material has left Wyoming, which is where the deposits are mostly in the United States, and left this country. They have no export license. It's printed in the New York Times. Okay. That material has left. So my question is, first of all, who's surprised by that? It's the federal government. They can't keep track of anything. But why was this a good idea? Why did Hillary's office and the Obama administration sign off on giving the Russians 1/5 of our uranium?
Yeah. So again, I will tell you, I do not subscribe to your facts, and the evidence is that at our ports, the one thing we monitor for is fissile nuclear material.
Yeah, it went through Canada. You can read the New York Times piece about it. But why was it a good idea to allow this, to sign off on this?
So again, as your audience should know, there were 9, 10 different federal agencies that all had to sign off before the
Obama administration agencies.
Exactly,
but they signed off. But why?
Of course. They did it because it was kind of, frankly, non-controversial. For the same reason, frankly.
But that's not a good reason. No, why was it a good idea? Why was it in America's interest to give 1/5 of our uranium supply to the Russians, which you are now arguing constitute the greatest threat we face?
First of all, again, 1/5 has not left. If there's some that's left the country, 1/5 hasn't.
They have control of it. Why is that a good idea to give a hostile power 20% of our uranium supply? It's insane, no?
So there's no shortage of uranium. That's uranium. That's why the price has dropped by 2/3.
So it is a good idea, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying the price has dropped. Why? Because natural gas is so cheap that building nuclear power plants, frankly, doesn't make sense.
That's not the concern. The concern is not that this uranium will go to build nuclear power plants. The concern, of course, will be used for offensive weapons. And that's the concern in the fact that it has been, that a fair amount of it, according to the New York Times, has been exported off this continent, not just to Canada, but off this continent. But here's the point. You're not going to answer the question. I can't find a single person who will defend this as a decision made by Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and others in that administration. Why would you do this?
Well, and I'm saying it wasn't a decision made by them.
Yes, it was.
It was made by people in agencies that they ran. But the fact is, there's zero evidence. This was raised a year ago. Again.
Oh, so they didn't know?
No.
How would Hillary Clinton not know if a Russian company was getting 20% of our uranium supply? What was she doing?
And that is the central fact, conjured fact, that people who are promoting the story have to hold on to, that Hillary either was derelict in her duty or knew, neither of which is the case. Why should she have known? Because the fact of the matter is, as this case in CFIUS, basically the foreign kind of law that deals with approving or not approving the export of material, that's not something that rises to the level of the secretary, whether her or Eric Holder or certainly the president.
But what you just said does rise to the level of nonsense, because the guy who founded Uranium One was a board member on their family foundation board. He gave over $100 million to the Clinton Family Foundation.
Right.
So they just kind of didn't know. I think it was $150 million Frank Wiestra, and you just didn't notice that the company he founded is about to go through the regulatory approval process with the agency you run?
So
I mean, that's insane.
The Clinton Foundation spent its money largely to tackle malaria, AIDS, childhood obesity, poverty, and women's
empowerment. How's that
empowerment.
going? Have people gotten a lot thinner? I'm just wondering, just as an ancillary
The fact of the matter is, millions of people have actually benefited from this. Go to Africa, okay?
Right.
You
They're
can
way
laugh here
thinner.
in Northwest Washington.
It's a svelte
Go
continent.
to Africa.
Right.
But
let
the
me
fact
ask
of
you
the matter is, so that is a scam. If Russians are actually underwriting that, we pulled one over on them.
Can I ask you a question? My final question, because sadly we're out of time, but you're going to say with a straight face that the guy who founded this country gave over $100 million to Hillary's family foundation. That company needs approval from her agency, and yet she was somehow unaware of this on a topic that's like inherently important to American national security.
Right, and my answer is people in the State Department were under oath by Republicans in the House and Senate, and 201, there's been zero evidence to suggest it even got to her attention, let alone that, and again, she was one of 10.
One
so
of 10.
Seriously,
and the fact that her husband has taken $500,000 in speaking fees from the Russians like 2 weeks before, that didn't come to her attention?
Well, again, evidently it didn't, either that or you have sort of widespread, sort of examples of people.
This is a tough one to defend, but I will give you about an A-. Most of that's
Man,
for
I'll
effort.
take that.
For effort.
Thank
you, Richard. Thank you.
They give everybody Wesleyan. Yeah.
Victor Davis Hanson is a fellow at the Hoover Institution over at Stanford. He's a professor emeritus at the University of California, Fresno, one of the smartest people in the state of California. Also author of The Second World Wars. He joins us now. Mr. Hanson, thanks for coming on. So,
thank you for having me, Tucker.
I think we can both agree, and any sober witness to this whole non-scandal over the past 11 months, I think would also agree, we haven't found collusion between the Putin government and the Trump campaign. What have we learned from this hysteria over Russia?
Well, I think we spent 95% of our investigatory resources, congressional, independent media, political, and we came up with nothing on the collusion, where 95% of the narratives, whether it was the Steele dossier, which involved taking the Fifth Amendment behind closed doors to the Devin Nunes's House Intelligence Committee, or the unmasking and leaking, in which one member who was unmasking claims now that the numbers that were amassed did not match the times that she did it in the case of Samantha Power. And now we have the Uranium One deal, we have the Podesta deal. So what we're seeing is the investigators are being investigated, and because there was never a collusion. And the reason with the Trump administration, and it begs the question, Tucker, was this anger, hysteria, as you I think rightly surmised, anger over the lost election that was blown, or B, was it an effort to overturn the election by impeaching or denigrating Trump to such a degree it was ineffective, or C, was it a preemptive, active effort to disguise a lot of exposure in these scandals that we've talked about? Your prior guest was sort of, with all due respect, absurd. His logic is sort of, drunk driving is not a threat until you actually kill somebody in a car. Drunk drivers pose no threat because they haven't killed anybody lately today, and we don't really have 20% of our own uranium. We only have about 5%, and of that 5%, that's used to generate about 20% of our electricity. So we're dependent on a company that's now controlled by Russian interests. And we should ask your guest: does he really think that today that if Bill Clinton went to Moscow, he would get $500,000 today, or does he think that the Clinton Foundation would receive a donation of $145 million today from Russian interests? To believe that's absurd. The only reason they got that type of money because they had something to offer, and that was to greenlight, as you said, the authority of Russian interests to gain control of uranium, and they thought that at least it was in their strategic interest. Well, all part of a reset effort by the Obama administration.
I think that's a great question, and more than a rhetorical one, because as it happens, Richard Goodstein has not made it out of our studio yet. So I want to put him back on the screen and pose the question you just posed to you, Richard. Do you think if Bill Clinton went to Moscow today, he'd be getting $500,000 for a speech?
He's getting money like that all over the place, and it's certainly well past the point that Hillary was no longer a candidate.
But you really think when you've got a deal of this magnitude and importance going through, and the former president, whose wife is one of the people signing off on the deal, gets $500,000 for a speech, I think we both agree that's insane. Yeah. The people who pay him expect nothing in return? I mean, come on.
I mean, was it insane when Ronald Reagan got $2 million from a Japanese company?
No, if he gave them 20% of our uranium supply,
I mean,
I would say yes.
So what you're saying is, and I hate that Fox is doing this, doesn't subscribe subscribe to the free market, right? That's what Bill
No, I
Clinton-
don't always
that's what
subscribe to the free
can
market,
bear.
actually. I think there is such a thing as greed. I think not every manifestation of capitalism is morally right. I think some of them are disgusting,
Well,
honestly. I don't know what to say. I mean, you know what I mean? Like,
course.
prostitution is wrong. That's the market.
But I'm just saying,
against it.
so
Okay.
is Reagan prostituting himself? My only point
just
is,
saying,
if you're
look-
pointing to big dollar numbers of speeches given by presidents, I'm sorry, you know, there's kind of a takes two to
So,
tango.
Victor Davis Hanson, do you think it's fair to put Ronald Reagan in the same category as Bill Clinton?
No, because Reagan wasn't selling anything. He was out of office. This whole donation to the Clinton Foundation was predicated on the assumption that Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and would likely be President of the United States. And you can ask your guest if he thinks this year or next year or the year after the Clinton Foundation is going to get $145 million from Russian interests. And he knows the answer is no, because they had something to sell. And that's what they sold. And they don't have anything to sell. So by their own calculation, they have no market value anymore. And the market is adjusted. There is a market, but it's not. There is a free market, but what he fails to point out, it's not a crony capitalism market that Clinton indulges. Now they're in the free market, and they have no profit. There's no motive to deal with them, so they're not going to make any money.
Good point. Professor Hanson, we're out of time. Thank you for the market lesson. Richard, I know you agree.
Absolutely.
Up next, the firm behind the infamous Trump dossier is fighting hard to keep its records secret. Why would they be doing that? What could those records reveal? In a minute, we'll talk to a lawyer at the center of that case. Stay tuned. Remember the Trump dossier, the mysterious, totally unverified document that was made public by BuzzFeed and included both scandalous allegations about Donald Trump as well as claims that the web company Webzilla was a front for Russian hacking of the DNC. It was like a parody of a scoop. It was so juicy it had to be true, except it wasn't. Since the dossier's release, Webzilla and BuzzFeed have been battling it out in court. Now, Fusion GPS, the company that may have created the dossier, is fighting efforts to open its books. This week, the company's executives pleaded the Fifth to Congress. Why would they do that? What could they be hiding? Is there an innocent explanation? Val Gervitz is a founding partner of Boston Law Group, which is representing Webzilla in all this. Val, thanks a lot for coming on tonight. So, this is one of those stories that is central to the Russia scandal and the hysteria around it. Maybe the most interesting thing we've seen in the 11 months of all of this, and yet it's undercovered by the press. Bring us up to date really quickly on where we stand now. You're representing the company that was libeled by the people who wrote this. How does Fusion GPS play into it?
Well, Fusion GPS is the party that hired Christopher Steele, the British former MI6 spy who wrote the dossier. And so certainly it would be interesting to know who was Fusion GPS representing
Yes.
in this transaction? In other words, who hired Fusion? Who's Fusion's client? What was the underlying purpose of the work that Fusion has done? And so we sent a subpoena of our own to Fusion, which they're also trying to fight in court in Washington. And I understand that their folks took the Fifth, which tells me that, you can't take the Fifth unless you have a reasonable cause to believe that the evidence you would give would put you in harm's way, so that you would actually be admitting to some kind of a crime.
Right,
and
that's right.
that begs the question, what is it that they think that they did wrong?
It may be that they're
truly
protecting,
concerned?
they may be protecting the person who paid them. Now, I don't know the answer to who paid for this dossier, but I can tell you, which you may know already, in Washington, it is universally believed to be a major Republican donor who was unhappy with Trump. Do you have any evidence for who paid for this?
We do not as of yet. We're looking for it, but again, yes, they're clearly trying to protect the identity of their client. How is revealing that identity a crime, however? In other words,
right.
Pleading the Fifth doesn't just, you can't simply plead the Fifth because you don't want to reveal some information. You've got to think that I kind of view this as, well, a neighborhood bully was hired to throw a rock through your window, and you now want to know who hired him, and the bully doesn't want to tell you.
So, but I think we can assume that whoever hired Fusion GPS to do this, to hire Steele and to write this dossier, did so in order to derail the Trump campaign. I mean, would there be another reason you would do this?
I don't see another reason, and certainly for my client's lawsuit, this would be actionable, important evidence, because it's up to us to prove, since we're the plaintiffs, that the allegations against Alex Gubarev, Webzilla, and XBT are completely false. And one way to prove it is to show that the entire motivation for that document was something nefarious. And
so I don't understand. I mean, this is probably a much longer conversation. We've only got a minute. But if you're investigating the Russian collusion story and you're a congressional committee, or you're Robert Mueller, wouldn't you want to know who paid for the dossier? Wouldn't that be one of your first questions?
Well, of course. From that point of view, maybe the Russians paid Fusion, and if so, Fusion should admit to it. And I suppose then Fusion might have a problem with everything, including treason.
That's a good point. We will find out who paid for that dossier, and it's going to be fascinating.
I'm certainly working hard to find out.
Thank you, Val. Great to see you tonight.
Yeah.
Nancy Pelosi has led the Democratic Party to defeat after defeat after defeat. It's basically her. We've reported on California Congresswoman Maxine Waters many times on the show, mostly because it's just unbelievable. She sits in Congress still. She's corrupt. She doesn't live in her own district. She once cheered on a race riot. Because of this, she's become a hero on the left. She's called Auntie Maxine for a willingness to say pretty much anything once the camera goes on. Though for the record, she's too afraid to do this show. We've asked her a number of times. But now Waters has apparently graduated from impeachment fantasies to what seem like assassination fantasies. Here she is at an event held at the Ali Forney Center in New York, October 13th of this year. Watch.
With this kind of inspiration, I will go and take Trump out tonight.
Now, we've called and emailed Maxine Waters' staff for comment on this to see if they can provide some additional context for the remark. Maybe we're misinterpreting. We're always open to that possibility. They haven't responded. Now, for some reason, most media aren't badgering Waters to explain. We know this because Waters was just interviewed 2 hours ago by MSNBC's Ari Melber. He didn't even bring it up. Now, imagine if this had been, I don't know, a year ago, and a Republican congressman had said, I look forward to taking out Barack Obama. How do you think that would have been treated? Well, Nancy Pelosi has taken the Democratic Party to 4 straight defeats in a U.S. House election. She'd played no small role in the party's defeat last November at the national level, which, as you know, was shocking to them. Perhaps at times she stepped down and give another leader a shot, but no. Pelosi says she's got to remain in office. She has to, not for any reason relating to political vision or acumen. No, Pelosi deserves to stay in charge, she says, because she's a woman.
The president invited us to dinner, and some of the cabinet members who were at the table, I was the only woman at the table, and that's why I have to stay there to be the one of the top women, top people at the table.
Kathy Aru is the publisher of Catalina Magazine. She joins us tonight to explain what exactly Nancy Pelosi meant. Kathy, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So she says, you need me because I'm a woman. I mean, leaving aside the fact that there are a lot of women to choose from in the Democratic caucus on the Hill, why is her gender central to her job?
That's not the only reason she said she's going to be there. She's been in political power for 30 years now. She's a great leader. She's great at what she does. She's a wonderful role model for women. So she didn't exactly say that she can be the only woman at the table, but she happens to be the only woman at the table.
She said it's important that I'm a woman.
It is important that there's a woman at the table.
Why is that important?
Well, because of the demographics of this country. 51% of the country are women. We should have the demographics of our politics look like our country.
No, that's not true.
What,
according to modern progressive orthodoxy, there are 63 separate genders now. It's not just men and women. It's not binary, Kathy. I don't know if you're keeping up with this stuff, and I'm dead serious. This is, I mean, I think it's insane, of course, but you're required to believe it. So if there are 63 separate genders,
then we should have them all at the table. We should have many genders
but then
at the
why
table.
does the same old, like, man, woman, why not give someone from another gender a
Fabulous.
shot?
We should, and we should start with having her at the table, and let's invite the other genders at the table. But let's keep Nancy Pelosi. She is smart. She is great at what she does, and the players on her team want her to lead the team. They want her to be the captain. The DNC chair supports her. The chairman supports her. Her caucus supports her.
But
that's why she's there.
But in real life, look, I mean, she held her Democratic Democrats together for the health care vote in the first Obama term. That was impressive. I agree with that.
Very.
Yeah, it was.
Republicans can't do that.
No, they can't. You're right. And she lost a historic number of seats for doing that. But she did a good job there. She's had no victory. She's had no victory since then. And you know as well as I had talked to a congressman about it today, she's not going to get the 218. If Democrats win in the midterm, she's not going to be reelected speaker because she's failed. Again and again and again.
Everyone knows, in D.C. knows, that those losses cannot be blamed solely on Nancy Pelosi.
I don't think
There's so many other factors that play into that.
Okay. But, I mean, look, pulling the woman card is a little bit weird to me, since we live in a moment where we are told, as a matter of official orthodoxy, my kids learn this in school, that you can change your gender just by saying so. So in a world where you can change your gender just by saying so, why is it important to be a specific gender? It's meaningless if you can change it just by saying so, isn't it?
So, I mean, so then we should have a woman and all those other genders at the table.
But why is it meaningful to be a woman if a woman can change into a man by snapping his or her fingers,
well, unfortunately,
which is what we're supposed to believe?
If she leaves, then we have all the men back at the table, and we're back 50 years. We need her there. She's a step forward in the right direction.
Okay, but then let me just, I'm going to try to put a finer point on for one last attempt to get into the meat of this, which is, what about being a woman or a man or a member of the other 61 genders makes you a different and better leader than if you weren't? What inherently about being a woman?
You have a different perspective. You have a different viewpoint. You see things differently. We need as many people to come to the table so we see things differently. That's what our country's made of. We all just can't be the same white guy sitting around a table just because we're afraid to invite anyone else to the table. Because men happen to be afraid of women in power. I mean, that's just a fact.
Democrats are? Really? No, I don't. I mean, I live with 4 of them. I'm not afraid at all.
No.
But I'm wondering though, I mean, you're talking about Democrats. She's not elected by Republicans. It's her Democrats.
But the GOP loves to take shots at her. They love to take shots at her.
The public doesn't like her, as you know. I mean, last question. She lives in one of the richest zip codes in the world.
Yeah.
In Pacific Heights in San Francisco.
Right. Just like Trump lived in one of the richest places in the world.
That's fine. I mean, I'm not here to defend Trump's zip code, but I'm just asking, do you really think that Nancy Pelosi represents all women?
Well, absolutely. She's not bought and paid for by anyone. That means that she's there for her own passion.
Your faith is childlike and therefore impressive. Kathy, thank you for joining us. Well, the media don't just hate Trump. For the most part, they don't like or understand the people who voted for Trump, and that's the real story. Up next, we'll talk to the former head of NPR, who thought a lot about this and decided to spend a year outside of his world in red state America and came away with a very different view than he had going in. It's a really interesting story. We'll be right back. President Trump has an unlikely semi-defender these days, former President Jimmy Carter, who's, I think, 94. The former president told the New York Times that, quote, the media have been harder on Trump than any other president, certainly that I've known about. A big driver of that hostility could be an unprecedented divide between the American media and the country they write about. Ken Stern was CEO of NPR, National Public Radio, and a distinguished member of the liberal bubble himself. As a longtime Democrat, he realized he didn't know that many conservative Republicans, so he did what no one ever does, and he spent a year traveling the country to meet people who think differently from him on their own terms. He's got a brand new book out, which is excellent, about that experience, called Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. Ken Stern joins us tonight. What does your family say when you said, I want to get out there and meet people who vote differently?
They thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
So, I live on a nice Democratic street in Washington, D.C., and my house is 100% Democrat. My wife and 10-year-old son were not too approving of this notion, and I suspect my neighbors weren't either. But I went out and really saw a world that I didn't know of. And it was a remarkable experience. I learned tons about Republicans, about the country as a whole. And that's really the source of the book. And it was...
Boy, I mean, we do segments like this all the time on the show about the divide, and increasingly no one ever talks to anybody they disagree with. What were your first impressions of this new world?
So one of the impulses for the book was the notion that we've actually become much more geographically and culturally divided than before. We have, 10 years ago there were about 1,000 landslide counties that one party or another won by 20% or more. This time around there was 2,500, about 60% of the country. We're increasingly dividing ourselves so that one side doesn't know the other. And I think going in, I had the typical Democratic attitude, not very flattering towards Republicans, but I sat in churches. You sent me pig hunting in Texas.
That was my recommendation.
It was. It was a great recommendation.
Did you meet any liberals pig hunting in Texas?
Pig hunting in Texas? Maybe the pigs, but no one else. It was just a remarkable experience. I met people who I would never have met otherwise, who had led remarkable lives, who served their communities, who had, I think, deep thoughts about the way their communities and their government should work. And I learned a ton from them. And that's really the experience.
The funny thing is, when you told me about this book, I think it was a couple of years ago, I thought it was a really cool idea. Now it seems like a completely radical idea that no one would ever do. How do you think, having done this and been in the media for so long, this divide affects the way that we cover news? It seems like most people who work in the press are from one America, but not the other. Yeah,
I think it's a fair criticism. And I think, so I was at NPR for a long time, and I knew, and I still know, that the people there try to tell a balanced story.
Yeah.
But what I never gave credit for until this time is that they live inside a certain bubble. We all do. And it drives what stories they think are important, what sources they look to, how they think about the story, and it's an enormous challenge, I think, for media, because it means that they don't tell the stories of half the country. And I think that's really what's missing from mainstream media.
I think that's right. There's very little cultural diversity.
Yeah.
So I actually learned something as someone who's spent his life hunting around guns. I didn't know how often guns were used defensively by law-abiding people in this country until I read it from you.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. For all the issues I plunged into, climate change, poverty programs, and guns, I really learned a lot from experts I would normally talk to.
Yes.
I talked to John Lott about guns and learned an enormous amount from him. And the biggest thing, and I'll get to defensive gun use, is, look, gun homicides in this country have gone down by over half over the last 20 years, as the number of guns in this country have gone up. We spend time talking about gun control, but we don't actually talk about the things that actually drove gun homicides down over the last 20 years. Why don't we talk about that more? The interest of the story, I didn't even know the term defensive gun use before this. And the Department of Justice estimates that it happens 60,000 times a year. There's a Florida State study that says about 1 million times a year,
but a lot.
It happens either way, high end, low end. It happens a lot, and I actually found stories. I told one of them in the New York Post this week about how people use guns to protect themselves. It's just an important part of the gun story that just isn't spoken about very much.
You wrote about a store clerk who repelled a robber with gunfire, walks out, knocks the guy down with a bullet, cigarette in his mouth, and says, "Castle Doctrine, baby."
Yeah, it's like a modern day Clint Eastwood. It was an unbelievable story.
Ken Stern, what a great book, and good for you for doing that. I don't know anybody else who would do that in your world. Thank you.
And thank you, Tucker, for your help with the book.
Oh man, I love it. California is about to punish people more harshly for using the wrong pronoun than for deliberately spreading disease. Is that unwise, or are we just not woke enough to understand? Are you woke enough? That's next segment. Stay tuned. California's lawmakers are chopping up their state's criminal code to keep up with rapidly shifting values that are changing so fast it is bewildering. The state used to fear people deliberately spreading HIV, which remains a chronic, incurable, and ultimately terminal virus. No more, under a new law taking effect next year, deliberately spreading HIV, doing it on purpose, knowing that you're doing it, is now in California a misdemeanor with a maximum punishment of 6 months in jail. Meanwhile, there are terrible new crimes in California, and the most terrible of all, misgendering someone. Also starting next year, healthcare workers who persistently use the wrong pronouns when working with seniors could be imprisoned for up to a year. Ethan Behrman is a California radio host. He joins us tonight to explain how exactly this works. So law sends, Ethan, thank you for joining us, especially on this topic.
Thanks, Tucker.
But law sends a clear message about what our values are. It's not just about who we want to put in jail, it's about what we believe. And the California legislature has just said in really clear terms, it is worse to call someone by the wrong pronoun than it is to deliberately infect someone with a fatal disease. That seems like an inverted value structure to me.
Well, it's not worse, and I'm not quite sure where the year is coming from in terms of punishment, and of course that's up to the judge, but what we have is something called elder abuse is what happens, and as our demographics change, the law needs to keep up with that. So if you want to be called something, shouldn't I, as basic human decency, call you what you want to be called?
Yeah, and I do
that's
that.
What we're talking about here.
Yeah, no, it's not what we're talking about. I mean, people change their names, women get married, for example, or whatever. I want to call you what you want to be called. That's always been my view, because I try to be polite. But that's very different from the state weighing in and saying if you somehow use the wrong name more than once or several times or in a way that we consider, quote, persistent, we're going to punish you more severely than we would if you knowingly gave someone a fatal disease. What the hell?
Well, so we have a couple of different issues there. First off, HIV is no longer the fatal disease. When you and I were living through the 80s and seeing people dying left and right in San Francisco, among other places, it was fatal. And now medicine has advanced that it's not fatal anymore. Okay. We are keeping people alive. Look at Magic Johnson.
Sure, that is true. But if you know people who have HIV, I'm sure you do. I do. First of all, people do die from it, for sure. Second, it's a huge deal. It's a big deal. It makes you really sick. It's super expensive. It's terrible. I mean, you could say the same thing about tuberculosis. Should we decriminalize the intentional transmission of tuberculosis or malaria? Of course not. And the only reason you're doing this with HIV is because there is a specific lobby dedicated to achieving this. And that's kind of the last government you want to have, one whose laws are written by various lobbies for various weird reasons. Don't you see where I'm going, right?
I absolutely see where you're going, and I still disagree with you, because what we have here is we have a specific demographic who generally has HIV, who is being discriminated against and has a tremendous history of discrimination in the United States. Otherwise, we wouldn't need things like the Stonewall riot in New York City, for example. And what's happening
wait a second. Why is it discriminatory?
Stigmatized by this.
Okay, but stigmatized. I mean, look. I don't care what, quote, demographic you're in. If you intentionally give someone an incurable disease, I don't care how much money you give to Nancy Pelosi. You should be charged with a felony for that. That's ridiculous behavior. I mean, right? Why are we making excuses for that behavior?
Because it isn't. It's not it's not manslaughter, attempted homicide anymore, because we are keeping people alive with HIV. The medicine has advanced tremendously.
Okay, so if I give you tuberculosis, which can be managed with antibiotics most of the time, like HIV, which can't always be managed, by the way, but most of the time, would that be a misdemeanor too?
Yeah, and morally speaking, why not any STD?
No, legally, because gonorrhea has never had the consequences of HIV or tuberculosis. But look, the tuberculosis sufferers don't have a lobby. That's the truth here. But as a moral question, you think it's okay, it shouldn't be a felony to intentionally give someone tuberculosis. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's wrong, just like you do. But is it a felony?
On purpose. Look, but again, just to be totally clear, this is on purpose. This is not, diseases are spread accidentally, and we understand that through recklessness or carelessness. No, this is on purpose. Like, I'm trying to give you this disease. That's not a felony?
No, and it's a misdemeanor in the state of California. We have determined, now that this is a misdemeanor for up to 6 months in jail for each offense.
I wasn't for California becoming its own country. I'm getting close. Ethan, thank you. Up next, the great Ainsley Earhardt needs no introduction. The star of Fox and Friends, here to discuss her brand new book. Stay tuned. Ainsley Earhardt, of course, co-hosts Fox and Friends in the morning. She also has a brand new book coming out entitled Through Your Eyes, My Child's Gift to Me. We're always happy to have Ainsley Earhardt join us as she does tonight. Hey, Ainsley, congratulations on the book. What's it about?
So it's about seeing life through your children's eyes. How many kids do you have? I can't keep them straight.
A ton.
A lot.
4.
I know, you're the expert on parenting. So the first book was about what I wanted to teach my daughter, because my dad had left me little notes, next to my cereal bowl with little messages before we went to school. So the first book was about that, and I was pregnant. And this book is, now that I've had the little girl, it's what I'm learning through her. It's through her eyes, and you learn so many things through our children. I was shopping, and I think my daughter was like 3 months old, and I was shopping, and I was just flipping through some clothes in the store, and I had her on my hip, and she starts cackling, and I turn around, and there's a dog behind us. You know how in New New York, these ladies, they take their dogs into the stores to shop.
I love that.
So I turn around and my daughter she is so excited, and I thought, she is seeing a dog for the very first time. How cool is that? We love dogs, we love animals, but I got to witness a human being who happens to be my child, who I love so much, see a dog for the very first time. And then one time I left my umbrella upstairs. I didn't even know it was raining. I came downstairs. I live on the 16th floor. So I come downstairs and it was raining. And I'm like perturbed. Oh my gosh, now I've got to go back upstairs. I've got to get the umbrella. I've got to turn the stroller around. And we were probably already late anyway. So I'm upset about that, or kind of upset about